Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and D.C. Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I am the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, D.C. Press Association, and I am delighted to have Alex Mann from the Baltimore Sun join us for our second masterclass of the summer. So the masterclass, we're drawing from our Best of Show winners from the MDDC contest, and Alex was the Best of Show winner for the profile category. So essentially what that means is he beat out over, I think it was about 70 other entries to garner that top prize, which is Best of Show over all divisions. So it's a pretty big deal. When Alex is not winning awards right and left, he is the courts reporter for the Baltimore Sun. He's previously worked on the Sun's emerging news desk. He covered crime and courts for the Capital Gazette and local government for the Carroll County Times, and is, I think, a very proud graduate of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. So welcome, and thank you for joining us, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So before we started to record, we had people talk about what they wanted to know about profiles. So before we kind of delve into what really will be a soup to nuts discussion in a short period of time about profiles, what attracts you to writing profiles? I mean, you cover all sorts of really interesting pieces, but what draws you to profiles, and how did this kind of idea for this profile come about?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think profiles are such a special opportunity to, first of all, get to know a person and then to share their story with the world, which is a little bit of the core of what we do on a daily basis, but it's an opportunity to go deeper than we do when we, just interview somebody for potentially a quote in a general news story. So I think profiles are a great opportunity to go beyond that. It's an opportunity to, with your writing, shed light on somebody's personality, and also to lay out their life story in a lot of senses. The story that you asked me to talk about Earl Young, the origin story is actually pretty interesting. I had actually met Earl Young more than 2 years before this story published. I was working at the Capital Gazette, and I was writing a story about the police department's new reentry program for returning citizens from incarceration. And I was sitting in a big conference room in the Annapolis Police Department, and they had arranged this meeting to introduced me to various stakeholders in this program and others who were knowledgeable about it. And in walked this man with a Baltimore City Schools ID. And when he introduced himself, and explained a snippet of his background, that he had served, decades in prison, my curiosity was immediately piqued at the time. And for a few years after, I didn't really have an opportunity to do the story, but I knew that I always wanted to know more about Earl and to eventually tell his story, because I thought it was remarkable. Here's somebody who served 34 years in prison for murder, which he participated in when he was a teenager, and now he's working in city public schools, mentoring other kids to avoid, simple mistake, as he describes it, that led, his and another individual's life to change forever. So I had always been interested in telling Earl's story. It was about finding the right time and obviously getting him to buy into it then. So that's the origin story.
Okay. Well, and so now do you get an assignment? I mean, this is me just being really naive. Do you get an assignment one day to say, I need a profile, or do you kind of just feel called at some point to say, this is a really compelling story that's going to bring out some of the themes in my other reporting? How do you get to
Yeah, you know,
decide?
I think this is what we might all refer to as something of an evergreen story. It's not tied to any specific event in time, so it can kind of be told um, any time of year. It's not connected to a news event. It's just a story about a really interesting person who's doing really interesting work.
Hmm.
Um, at the Sun, we always get pressure around the holidays to produce an evergreen story. You know, it's the time of year where most people have vacation time scheduled, so um, they, the editors are insistent upon having some stories that don't have necessarily pegs, um, so that we can make sure that the paper is robust through those months where we or weeks where we might be a little thin on reporting staff. So
Hmm.
um, when that time came around, I just knew this was the story that I wanted to do, and I had to get some buy-in from my editors because I knew uh, I wanted to go in depth with this story and go beyond something simple. So I had to get a little bit of buy-in to to say, yeah, no, you have our blessing. Go ahead and do it, and do it the way that you see fit.
Hmm. So it sounds like pro tip is always to have a couple evergreen stories or profiles sort of up your sleeve, and they can really have a long arc. You know, this took years to kind of come to completion. So some. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so, and I think maybe the other point to take away is that um, somebody who you found really interesting at some point in your career, that was kind of on the, maybe you could say that they were on the outskirts of another story that you were working on, um, could uh, could be a great subject for a story down the road, even if the time isn't quite right then and there. So it's important to uh, establish that relationship and um, try to maintain it.
All about building that network. And so I want to shift now. Now you've sort of talked about the who and why of a profile. Let's talk about how you craft questions to really draw out what's interesting. I mean, how do you avoid making it Cindy Jones was born in 1942 and she had a happy childhood and then blah, blah, blah. Like, is it the questions that make those details come alive or some other magic?
Well, I don't know that there's any magic to it. I think a lot of it depends on your subject. The person that you're interviewing. I typically, and for a story like this, I don't even go into it with questions written down or prepared. I just maybe have a list of bullet points for talking points that I want to address, and treat it like a conversation, where I'm trying to learn about this person. And there are a couple of times based on maybe the bullet points that I came into the conversation with, where I might direct it in a certain way to try to get at a point that I feel like is really important to hit. I mean, in this case, in this story, um, Earl, um, he was very forthcoming about his sort of redemption and the arc of his story that was him rebuilding himself and and becoming a better person, so to speak. But he was a little bit less forthcoming when it came to talking about what had happened on that fateful night in, I can't remember the year, but in the 80s. And I knew that was a point that we had to address. So um, something that I tried to do sensitively, with empathy, understanding that um, it obviously it wasn't something that he was super eager to talk about, but that we really needed to. So I think treating it like a conversation is important. I think maybe that makes folks feel a little bit more comfortable, um, and then details come out that you might not even have expected if you go in with kind of a script, rather than a little bit more of an open book. So those are some of the things that I think about.
So, when, I mean, and no one likes to talk about probably one of the worst moments in their life. It's not some, and I can also understand that people don't want to be defined by a single moment in their life. Um, so how do you push? How did you get Earl to open up about that night or that situation in a way that keeps that conversation flowing, but also goes deeper?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was being transparent with him in that I wasn't intending to write a story that rehashed what happened that night and that dwelled on that for a long time. I just felt like it was a point that we had to touch on,
Mhm.
um, just to better understand, his perspective, and some of it, I already had some of the details from court records that I had collected, and read in preparation for our conversation. So part of it was just wanting to hear, explaining to him that I just wanted to hear his side of
Mhm.
what happened, his perspective, and even if just to better appreciate how he learned from it and how what happened influences and impacts his work now, um, helping mentoring kids in the schools, um, and I think part of what came out was, in him addressing that night from his perspective, was just how sort of um, basic of a mistake that he made. I mean, from his telling, he chose to take his mom's car out without his permission and go riding around with friends, and um, you know, according to him, unbeknownst to him, they engaged in an attempted robbery that went horribly. So having that perspective was really important to the story, and uh, when I think for him there was a benefit too, rather than just having it from court records, saying what prosecutors said happened.
Mhm.
Um, and of course there was a way to balance that in the writing, but that sort of helped me get to that point in our conversation.
And listening to you speak, it strikes me that in a profile, you're really, you are in so many ways allowing that person to share their perspective and their experience in almost an unfiltered way. And when you're doing, say, a court story, you're more about like a little bit more transactional about like this is the chain of events, this is what's happening. Let me help the reader understand the situation as opposed to I want the reader to understand this person. Am I getting that right?
I think you're spot on there. I mean, you're trying to get you're well. Listen, what is a person if not a combination of situations that occurred in their life, that contributed to them becoming who they are now, and that's the ultimate goal, is to to tell the story of the person. So yes, I think you're spot on.
Good. I just wanted to make sure I was getting it right. So as we talk about sort of questions and things that you do to draw out your subject, really it sounds like it's a conversation. It's sort of going in and articulating from your standpoint what like the why you're doing this profile on this person anyway, like what makes them interesting, and then talking more specifically about that and sort of what builds into it. Um, I'm curious also because in the world you don't always get to write the really long feature profile. Sometimes you're just doing like the capsule profile, like, oh, here's a, this person is getting an award, or this person is, sort of like the sidebar. How can you
Mhm.
sort of dip in and use some of those skills uh, in your other types of reporting, or in that sort of short form uh, profile piece?
So I think even in a short term or a short form profile piece, you still want to get to know as much about the subject as you possibly can, and to understand them as well as you possibly can. Um, and I think what that does is that allows you to um, be able to latch on to an anecdote or some sort of example from their life that you can tell a little bit more concisely, that has a greater, it's an anecdote that tells the reader a lot more about who this person is, rather than um, biographical information.
Mhm.
um, some sort of um, something that happened in their life, or some sort of interaction that um, tells you more about who this person is. And I think the only way you can understand which anecdote or interaction um, tells more about a person is by really sitting down and getting to know them better,
Mhm.
because otherwise you won't recognize it. So it can be of course difficult to go from a really lengthy interview to um, a couple hundred words, a couple hundred word story. Um, but that really long interview can help you choose how to approach the story um, in an interesting way.
Mhm. So now let's turn to sort of the writing aspect of things, and we'll save some room for questions from our audience as well. So don't worry if Alex hasn't hit on something you want to understand. We'll get to that. But so you have, the research that you've done, you have the interview, and now you're sitting down to write, and you have all this stuff. How do you piece it together? How do you make sense of what you want to write? And I think also with Earl's story, you have a whole, like, you've written inches and inches and inches, feet even, on reentry and mentoring and what the mayor's doing with, violence prevention and things like that. So you have all this wraparound information. How do you make sense of it all in the writing process?
Well, I think that's the hardest thing to do, is to. I mean, I always like to gather as much information as possible for a story like this. And then when you finally sit down and say, "Oh my goodness, how am I gonna parse this out? How am I gonna narrow this down?" That's the hardest part. I think you kind of have to go back to the sort of the core of your pitch. Why are you telling this story? In Earl's case, um, I I thought that the work that he was doing was really interesting, and I thought it was relevant given his connections to the mayor's office and the city school system. But just him talking about his work, I don't think um, was that interesting of a story. I think it's how he got to that point. How does a man get from um, serving a life sentence and feeling hopeless behind bars as a teenager to mentoring other teenagers in schools as a free man? So I think, you know, that was what I wanted to accomplish with this story. And I think, you have to, once you've figured out what you want to accomplish, then you can pick details. You can pick quotes. You can pick collateral information that sort of fits that narrative, that that story that you want to tell about this person. Did that answer your question, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think it's important to like it sounds like if you start off with more clarity on what you want to get out of the story, that's going to be your North Star. And there may be, and I want to ask you, like, what if there are interesting sort of tangents and sidelines? Because everyone, we all contain multitudes. So how do you either integrate like this really interesting detail that might not relate to the story arc that you're trying to create? Do you just leave that on the cutting room floor, say that might be a story idea for next time, or do you kind of weave it in?
Yeah, I would say if it's a tangent that doesn't relate to the reason that you're telling the story, I think that that has to be something that you have to consider for the chopping block. I think it might be, while interesting, it could be confusing to a reader. It could distract them from the story that you're trying to tell. Um, and yeah, I think, hopefully if you spend a lot of time with a person and talk to other people about them and collected records, as many records as you can, and other sources of information about them, hopefully you have plenty of great insight and material, so to speak, um, that you're going to have to decide what to cut eventually because you can't use it all. And if it's a tangent, in my opinion, I think it could be distracting, and I would stay away from it. Maybe it's something you can come back to at another time. Um, but I think with profiles, you're trying to get this person's story to resonate with somebody, and I think doing that um, requires not distracting the reader.
Sounds like ruthless pruning. I mean, it's summertime, so I'm thinking of the garden and how, you have a plant or you have a tree that, you want it to take a certain shape, and everything extraneous has to be chopped off, even if you're like, well, that's a really healthy root or that's a really healthy branch. That's okay if it doesn't like make the story, or in this case, in my metaphor, the tree kind of be what you want it to be. So it sounds like you have to be kind of ruthless, in a loving way.
Yeah,
So
you do. Sorry, go ahead.
no, no, feel free to go on, because I want to get more into the technical aspects of like how you like the structure of the profile, because that was something that people wanted to know more about.
Yeah, no, I didn't have anything else to add on that point. So
All right, let's jump into
go ahead.
structure then. So, how are profiles in the structure of a story kind of different from everyday reporting? Some people had wanted to ask about like, well, what kind of lead do you put in there? What type of lead? How do you grab people from the get-go? Is it so different from regular news reporting?
Well, I think it can be. I think a profile is an opportunity to get creative with your lead and really the 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 narrative arc of the story. So in that respect, I think it's different than in some ways from the nitty gritty daily reporting. Um, I think for me, when I just as a writer, I typically like to give the reader something, uh, some sort of setting, visual or interaction that's tangible that they can kind of latch onto at the beginning of a story. Um, it, it, it really depends on what you have. Um, you could always go with an anecdote from somebody's life. In this case, in this story about Earl Young, one of the things that I really wanted to get that I wasn't really able to was access to him doing his job. With students, there were reasons that I wasn't able to go sit in, with him while he was mentoring kids. And part of it was that he didn't want to tarnish his trust with them. So when I was thinking about how to start this story, I sort of came up with the idea that this one sort of authentic interaction that I overheard over the phone, him talking to a student in a busy high school class or a hallway, was an interesting way to get the reader to keep going, or to at least engage them until they're getting to the point where they're figuring out why they're learning about this, why they're hearing this interaction.
So it sounds like you will often use an anecdote or something that sort of exemplifies, or shows the reader, paints that mental picture and says, this is kind of the crux of what we're going to be talking about in this profile. Like, here's the journey of where we're getting to. Am I getting that right? Or it sounds like you don't have a tried and true, like, this is how I start all my profiles. Or do you?
Um, no, there's no cookie cutter way to do it. I think I approach each story a little bit differently. I definitely do, I think, have a tendency in my writing to lean towards something visual or tangible that, again, that the reader can sort of latch onto at the beginning. Maybe it's just that those are the kind of leads that I like to read. But I've written a lead that had to do with a retired crime scene technician in Baltimore, walking into a courtroom in shackles and handcuffs, and just to me, the picture of that is so powerful that as a reader, I would want to know more. Why is this person who worked in law enforcement being led into the courtroom in handcuffs and shackles? It was a little bit different with Earl Young, but it's just another example of maybe the way that I might think about leading a story.
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. Um, is there anything else that is different or notable about writing profiles, like in the actual structure or how you go through that writing process before we move on to editing?
Um, I think that it's important to keep in mind what we already discussed, and that is sort of the why you're telling this story, and to keep that in mind as you're um, going down the page. Because if you stray away from that, I think, again, it will be um, confusing to readers, and it might distract them or stop them from continuing to read about who this person is, which is your ultimate goal. So I think every detail that you choose, every the way that you structure the story um, can needs to come back to that original point. I mean, in the case of the story about Earl, there are a couple different sections in the story. For each, I sort of thought about, sort of a mini lead for each section. Again, something tangible that they can, that the reader can grasp onto, or something that makes them want to keep reading until the next sentence. Whether it was a sentence about a little girl's killing, rattling, hardened criminals in the penitentiary where Earl was, or an anecdote from his childhood. The thinking on the latter being, uh, how did this little kid who liked fishing and was in the Boy Scouts end up in prison?
Mm-hmm.
And the thinking on the former is, I'm trying to tell you that I'm putting you, the reader, behind the penitentiary walls a little bit,
Mhm.
um, and trying to tell that part of Earl's story, foreshadowing that part of Earl's story a little bit, that what he experienced behind bars um, had a profound impact on him.
Absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. And I know that you're not an editor, but you're when a profile goes through that editing process, um, it sounds like you're with profiles, you're really invested. You've gotten to know this person, you have the story arc, you know what you want to do. How do you kind of contend with that process and sort of is this a back and forth between you and your editor all along to be like, this is my vision, this is how I want to carry it forward? Or is it more, okay, you send it off to be edited and it comes out hopefully not radically different than you started, but how do you kind of contend with that editing process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be a back and forth. They It should be a back and forth where you have an open mind despite your passion for the story and the person whose story you're sharing, um, because I think that um, number one, if your editor can't figure out the why soon enough in the story, then other readers are going to have a problem with that. And if they feel like you're drifting too far away from the why, again, it's something that might distract readers. So I think you have to appreciate their perspective as somebody who is sort of impartial.
Mhm.
So I, um, again, I think you have to go. It should be a back and forth, but you should have an open mind. I think that uh, you know, if my editors told me this is the maximum amount you can write on this, and I turned in something that was more than that, then I should expect some harsh words and maybe some harsh cuts that I might not like. So I really want to try to take care of that on the front end, so that it's nothing hopefully too drastic in the form of cutting, because I want to be the one that's choosing what's in the story. I don't want them be the ones choosing details to omit. So if I'm uh, turning in something that's 500 words too long, and they're just going to start cutting out details, and the ones that stay in there might not be the ones that I would choose.
Mhm.
Even though that decision is really hard, that's something you have to think about on the front end, I
Sure.
think.
Well, and I think also that's what leads back to, how you can be more concise, how you know which details to cut and which ones to keep in. Maybe it's nice, or maybe a strategy could be, think about your editor sitting on your shoulder. And, if they needed to cut 200 words, what are you okay with them cutting? And what are you not?
Yeah,
Um,
I think one more thing about choosing what to cut and what to keep. Um, I think when you're writing a profile, and it's a little bit different when you're working on a really quick turnaround, but you have so much from your interview with the person, but oftentimes that writing exclusively through their words hold you back a little bit as a writer in terms of being able to say things with authority, things that you've found in documents or from other sources. So I really strive to mix in um, or to even have a lot of um, the a lot of the substance in the story come from those other sources, and then let the personality come out through the things that I gained in an interview. So the interview might help direct me to other places or other sources where I can get facts about the person, um, and then I can write it in a different way than everything in the story coming from an interview with the subject. Um,
right.
so that's something I would think about. really trying to use the interview as a way to um, uh, introduce personality, to tell you about a person's thinking, because I can't write that, just independently as a fact. That's something that has to come from them. But there are other things that I can get as facts, from other sources, and I think that contributes to stronger writing.
Yeah. And more factual writing. I mean, everyone is kind of an unreliable narrator in some respects about their own life. And memory is fallible, and it's nice to have, you don't want to have single source reporting. Um, so we'll turn to questions in just a minute. So people who are on the call with us start thinking of questions. We'll probably have room for three or four. But while you all are masterminding, Alex, I wanted to ask you how profile writing and your experience of profiles carries through into your everyday sort of daily news writing. Does it have an effect? Is it porous in some way?
Yes, because I think that there's a lot you learn from writing profiles. I mean, even from the perspective of having this just overwhelming amount of information that you might all find interesting, and having to condense it down into the profile that you're writing, is valuable for, uh, writing, other types of stories. Um, I think even thinking about quotes in a lot the same way that I mentioned about a profile, can be useful for a regular, general news story writing too. Are you using the quote to state a fact? And if so, is it worth including? Or is the quote, really, adding some sort of, way, a person's way of thinking, or something that doesn't come through just through the nuts and bolts facts. So, I'm sure there's plenty more that could be said about that, but those are just a couple of the things that come to mind.
Yeah, sure. Just add that splash of color. All right, I want to turn for our next 9 minutes. I want to turn to the people on the call. Does anyone have a burning question they'd like to ask Alex? Anyone? Well,
I
I don't.
have a
Oh,
question.
yeah, go for
Yes.
it.
So I was more interested in learning about the opening, but because of who Earl Young is, and how he's a very intricate person, especially with his past and what he's doing currently, how do you balance, holding him accountable for his past, but also showcasing his humanity?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think in a lot of respects, the facts hold him accountable to his past, um, and he yeah, the facts of what happened, I think, hold him accountable to his past. But at the same time, he was pretty open about how he has learned from it, and continuously tries to learn from his past. Um, so I think, I tried to balance it out by including details, um, of what happened. I also tried to balance it out by telling readers a little bit about the life that was lost. Irvin Jones, that was actually pretty difficult to do because, um, Irvin's family, was both of his parents were killed, several years after he was killed. So I actually found an old, newspaper clip about, Irvin Jones's killing, and it was written by a columnist at the Sun, who had since moved on, to the Washington Post, where she did a completely different job. But the column was suggested that her family knew him. So I actually reached out to this columnist at the Washington Post and said, "Hey, I saw your column from decades ago. I'm writing about this. I'm wondering if you can help me get in touch with, Irvin Jones's family." And she ended up telling me that, it was actually her brother who was really close with him, but she put me in touch with her brother, and I was able to talk to him, and some of his other classmates about the person that he was, and include that. And I think that's a way of holding him accountable to his past too.
Thank you, Melody. Appreciate that. What other questions do people have? And actually, as you ask your question, just because some people are just listening to this, please introduce yourself. Any other questions?
I have a question. Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm interning with the Daily Record this summer. And I know this was kind of asked earlier, but I had a question about finding people to profile. Just because I know for a lot of people, like with the summer internship, we're like just getting into our beats, just getting to know like the players in our beats and who we're interviewing and looking for. And at least for me, I haven't really stumbled across anyone who I've really seen I want to profile. Do you have any other recommendations for, how we can really find someone who would make a good profile?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Natalie. And I think it's a good one, and I think it's a difficult one. Maybe um, one thing to consider is um, people that you've found interesting in other reporters' stories, because often they're not the sole focus of the story; they're just a small piece of it, and they might even just have a quote in a story, but that person has a whole story of their own to tell if you're interested. So maybe that's another place to look. Um, Otherwise, I think it's about maybe sort of narrowing down to a subject matter that you're interested in, and literally poking around for people that are you know uh, important or up and coming players in that subject matter, and reaching out and giving it a shot. But I appreciate that you and other interns are in a really tricky situation, because you might not end up in a room at the police department where you bump into somebody that has a incredible story. Um, but I think part of it is also just approaching every other story with a level of curiosity about the people um, that might not play a huge role in the daily story, but that might be interesting for something bigger.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you for that, Natalie. All right. We probably have time for just one or two more questions. Anyone else have a burning question? Actually, I have a question for Karen Denny if she's still on the line. Because Karen, you come from a sort of a college experience. What sort of on how does Alex's experience kind of match up with how you're teaching profile writing in at the University of Maryland?
Well, that's a good question. I think the fundamentals are there. So you have to, first of all, you have to be a good writer. You have to be a good reporter in order to tell someone's story with respect and care. And then you have to be curious and ask questions and notice stuff. So I think that's sort of part of the fundamental stuff that people get in college. And then you can apply that to, whether you're a sports reporter, a broadcast person, right? A print reporter, that curiosity, and then understanding how to be sensitive and fair and ask good questions is all part of what comes with it. And I think, with Alex, he's a person who pays attention to people and is interested in people and notices things. And I think that's and he's a particularly sensitive writer and a caring person, and that's what comes through and makes him such a good reporter. Yeah.
No, I thank you for that, Karen. I think that's really important to note that you do have to be interested and care about what you're writing about and the people that you're interacting with. And Alex, certainly in this story, I think you've taken some really you've taken considerable effort to flesh out this portrait of a complicated man in difficult situations who has caused irreparable harm and still is finding a way to forge a path. And you dance around all the other paths that he could have taken as well, which would have been easy to take, and still have sort of brought that arc to be really a very powerful story of doing good in the world, no matter your circumstances. So I don't know if that was the story arc that you were trying to go for, but that's what I got out of it, and it was a very powerful story.
Well, I very much appreciate you saying that, Rebecca. Thank you very much.
And so I think now we are just about out of time. So I wanted to thank Alex again for joining us today. This was a really interesting discussion. I've learned so much about profile writing. I hope that everyone here has as well. And I cannot wait to see what you are sending in for your next profile entry in the MDDC contest this year. So look forward to seeing that. Thank you for being
Thanks.
with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca. It's been a pleasure.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, @mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.